Hello and welcome to this session, Implement the Top 10 Security Features for Microsoft 365. My name's Liam Cleary and I'm CEO at Shareclicity, as well as a Microsoft MVP and a certified trainer. You can reach out to me on my Twitter account at HelloIt'sLiam or Shareclicity, or my blog site at HelloIt'sLiam, or my website Shareclicity. I spend all of my life working with Microsoft 365 and Azure. I create training courses with a heavy focus on security and compliance. You can see my courses at Pluralsight, Skill Me Up and LinkedIn Learning, as well as any classes that I teach. So what are we going to talk about in this session? Well, we'll first talk about the core security categories. There are 6 that we can identify within Microsoft 365. We'll then talk about logins and accounts, and we'll review the risks and available protections. We'll also then talk about data flow and review the risks and protections. And then lastly, we'll talk about devices with the risks and protections. So to get started, let's talk about the core security categories that are available in Microsoft 365. Now, there are 6 core categories that kind of, if you peel all the layers back from within Microsoft 365, it comes down to these 6. The first one is the front door, so authentication and authorization. Second is the data and the content, so the intellectual property or the files, etc. that you own. Third is the sharing, so where this content's going to go, whether you're sharing it cross-department, cross-individuals, or even externally. Then, of course, we've got access control, which obviously is the permissions and restrictions that we assign to the applications, the locations where the content's stored. Of course, we have mobile devices, so another access entry point. So how are we connecting from Windows 10 devices, iOS devices, Android phones, etc. And then, of course, our perimeter edge. And I think often we actually forget about that we actually have a perimeter edge that's actually part of Microsoft 365. Now, if we take some of these, so let's talk about logins and accounts, we can actually break this down further to help us create this set of core controls. So login and accounts, my number one thing here is multi-factor authentication. So this is our first kind of protective barrier, I suppose, that we can apply to our tenant. The next would be interactive user sign out. So this has been around for a long time, but the ability to sign users out after inactivity of a certain amount of time. Of course, account lockout is quite common. Then, of course, we have password expiration. And then we have banned passwords. So for logins and accounts, we have 5 specific protections that we can utilize to help us protect better in Microsoft 365. Now, if we look at the data flow category, we end up with 3 specific options. The first is what's called app consent. So app consent is about the applications that end users can actually utilize within the applications and whether they can consent to the application retrieving details about them. Next would be forwarding rules, which for lots of breaches and attacks on Microsoft 365, email forwarding rules are a attack vector that's used quite commonly. So once an attacker gets into the system, they then forward the mail to other locations. And then, of course, external sharing. That's one of the whole reasons for moving to Microsoft 365 is to allow you to externally share content with others and collaborate. But it needs to be protected. So now we've gone from 5 to 8. So if we then go to our devices category, we then end up with, firstly, our legacy authentication, which often lots of devices connect to Microsoft 365 using legacy authentication. And then, of course, we have our mobile application management protections. And we could include MDM, but I'm excluding mobile device management from this because I'm thinking more of the bring your own device capability. So from day one, we get a tenant and Joe Bloggs can go home, open up his iPhone and log into Microsoft 365 without any restrictions whatsoever. So that gives us 2 more. So if my math is correct, that's 5 for logins and accounts. Then we get 3 for data flow and 2 for devices. That gives us our top 10 list of things to implement within Microsoft 365. So let's go and delve into each one of these one by one. And we'll first review the risks and then we'll review the protections that Microsoft offers. So first off, let's talk about multi-factor authentication. So we have a risk. Now, we could spend probably hours talking about the risks of not having multi-factor, but if we were to peel the layers back, nearly every data and security breach involves some compromising of an account. Whether it's an admin account, a user account, an email address, it doesn't really make a difference. The compromised account then allows for other attacks to take place, especially within an organization. So the idea behind this is it's called pivoting. So I can send a phishing email, let's say, to somebody in the organization. They will then click on that link for me, log in, I will get the credentials, and then use their machine to then perform further attacks onto others. What you often find also is that multiple applications or services often use the same account and often the same password. So the risk is real. It's been around for a long time. So it's a risk that's in the cloud also. It's a risk in Microsoft 365. So what is the protection? Well, when we apply multi-factor authentication, every account authentication attempt is then required to perform that second factor validation, obviously based on the specific timeouts that you kind of set. All it requires is installing the Authenticator application on a device that you can utilize. And of course, it can be implemented either directly against individual users, or we can use some of the conditional based logic. So what's the protection going to do for us? Well, it's going to make sure that if someone does compromise the credentials, that it has to pass that second factor. In actual fact, if you read lots of articles online, it will talk about that 99% of some of these data breaches would never have happened if multi-factor authentication had been enabled. Our next block, our next, I suppose, protection feature is the sign out inactive users. Now, what is the risk that we're trying to protect from? Well, first off, this has been around for a long time. I remember writing code as a software developer, trying to make sure that we could auto time out so that somebody wasn't left logged in a kiosk or in an internet cafe, which people don't really use nowadays. But the idea is that you have this long or non-existent session timeout, which means that other people can often come in behind the other person and they will be authenticated as if they were that person. So an attacker could reuse an existing session and could have access to the user information of the previous person because the session was never closed. That still stands in Microsoft 365 too, because people like to save sessions and have longer expanded times. Now, what protections do we get? Well, of course, within Microsoft 365, we specifically have a feature for signing out inactive users. So after a specific period of time of inactivity within SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, the automatic sign out occurs. Now, of course, don't worry about shaking your mouse and trying to control it. It doesn't work that way. It's a bit more sophisticated. But what it does is it works on the user requests that are sent to those two applications. And at that point, it will then determine, when to sign out and when to send a message. So it's a very simple protection, but it's a very powerful one. I actually worked with an organization where they had lots of kiosks, and this was a critical protection that had to go in place. Our next one that goes along with this is protection of the account. Now, this is account lockout we're going to talk about. Now, what's the risk? Well, this one's been around for years and years. The idea that someone can continue to knock on the door, so to speak, with an account, hoping to gain access because the account never gets locked out. So many successful account compromises happen because of this, that not only do they not have multi-factor authentication, but I can literally throw password lists at it and the account never gets locked out. So what is the protection? Well, Azure Active Directory uses what's called smart lockout. So it uses cloud intelligence to lock out what would look like or be a malicious actor trying to guess the password. So for example, if I'm logging in, I'm only ever going to type a single password. And so the intelligence in the cloud will know that and it won't lock me out. But if Sue, the hacker down the street, decides that she wants to try and break my password and starts trying to log in with a password list of 50 passwords and it keeps just iterating, then the protection will kick in and it will automatically identify that and start to restrict the account. Now, the default setting for this is 10, so 10 failed sign-ins, it will obviously throw somebody out. Now, the smart lockout itself it locks the account from sign attempts for a minute after every 10 failed attempts. The account then locks again after each subsequent sign attempt for 1 minute, and then it gets longer and longer and longer the more times. The smart lockout also tracks the 3 bad password hashes, or the last 3. So if I've got a list of 50 and I put 3 in, it remembers those, so it doesn't, it doesn't just increment the counter, it looks for the uniqueness of the passwords. And then smart lockout is always on. So for every Azure Active Directory customer, these settings are there by default, and there's nothing that you actually have to do. So it gives you the balance of security versus usability. Now the values for this are available in the Azure Active Directory portal. You can choose security from the left, click password protection, and then you get these 2 options that are available here. So the lockout threshold and of course the duration in seconds. And those are the default values, which is 10 for lockout and 60 seconds for the duration. Now, to combine with the smart lockout, we obviously need to talk about setting passwords to expire. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? That's one of the longest ongoing arguments ever. So what's the risk? Well, if we don't expire the passwords, then this is the perceived risk, is that the users will tend to pick a weaker password and maybe vary it slightly. Have a different number at the end, add a different value, or put a special character at the end to make it unique. The users will often tend to reuse existing passwords once they've found one that's pretty secure. Now, that doesn't really help us if the definition of a secure password is different for me than it is for you. So, for example, all of my passwords that I use are a minimum of 17 characters. And I don't think that's actually super secure. But for me, 17 characters is just great. But for you, you may think 17 characters is ridiculous, and why can't I just have 8 or a PIN code? So the risk is very subjective and perceived. Now, the good news is Microsoft provides capabilities. And this is based on, actually, what's interesting is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, so NIST, they create guidelines for security. They recommend actually disabling password expiration, and so does Microsoft. So you should only force a change or an update of a password if an account is confirmed as being compromised. Now you may think that's a bit strange. Well, why would I have a password last forever? Well, think about it. If I have multi-factor authentication enabled on my account and my password isn't set to expire, then it doesn't really make a difference, because every time an authentication request goes in, I actually have to pass the second factor. Now, should we change the passwords? That's entirely up to you. Recommendation has still always been to have some mandatory password expiration, or to move to a passwordless sign-in, which is also available as part of Azure Active Directory. So how do we implement something like this? Well, we can do this by using PowerShell. So first off, we can check if a specific user has a password policy, and this is done by delving into the Get Azure AD User PowerShell, retrieving a specific property called Disable Password Expiration. If I then wish to set the password to never expire, I can either do it for a single user, or in this case, I can just say Get Azure AD Users, and then pipe the value out to say set the Azure AD User password policy to disable. But the choice is yours, but it's definitely an option, and I would highly recommend considering not expiring passwords. Now, of course, to go with the passwords, depending on what you choose to do, let's implement a banned password list. Now, what's the risk here if we don't have this? Well, it's common practice for end users to reuse passwords. We've already talked about that. It's also common for end users, I'm going to pick these up here, to use a sticky note to put the password on and to hide it under the keyboard, or stick it on the monitor, or put it in the drawer, or put it behind a picture, or even not to use those and just use a password that's really straightforward and easy to kind of get a hold of. Or you try to be clever and, do password 1234 or password @123 or password $! And then something. Trying to be clever by not being clever, because the passwords can be easily guessed because they're just a bunch of arbitrary values. So what can we do? Well, we can provide a password list of banned passwords. So Azure Active Directory includes this global banned list. So when a user is then asked to set their password, if it matches a prohibited password, then they'll have to go back and reset it again. You can store up to 1,000 of these in this box. It's not the best user interface, I'll be honest with you. If we have a look at this, we're actually going to go into Azure Active Directory, click Security, Authentication Methods, and then Password Protection, and you'll see that we get this kind of just rectangle where we can just paste in, one on each line, a list of banned passwords, and we can enforce it. And if you have the agent installed locally onto the Windows machines, on premises, if we're doing that, then we can kind of flow that all the way through. Okay, so let's go onto our tenant, our Microsoft 365 tenant, and we'll look at how we configure some of these protections. So here we are in the Microsoft 365 tenant. So our first thing we want to do is talk about multi-factor authentication, inactive user sign-on, etc. So what we can do is we can go into users here and click active users, and this will present us the list of the users within the tenant. And you'll see right here, so let me just scroll in a bit, you'll see multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to scroll back out. If I click multi-factor authentication, this will take me into a new web browser, well, a new tab at least, which will basically give me the old kind of layout, I suppose, of management. And what I can do is I can click on a del, for example, here, and you'll see that if I click enable, I get this enable multi-factor authentication. So this is a valid approach. I can go in and say enable multi-factor authentication. It's going to be successful. And if I just wait for that to refresh over here and click back on a del, it then says disable and enforce. If I click enforce, then what this will do is if I'm trying to use other applications, I have to generate app passwords, but I'm not going to do that. But I can simply say disable, choose yes, it'll refresh. I can then go back, and if I click on a del, it'll then say enable. Now, that works great, albeit on a per user basis. Now, if you don't have the conditional access licenses or policies that you can create, then of course that's the way of doing it. Now for me, conditional access is the better approach. So I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory. I'm going to launch this for the tenant and then click on Azure Active Directory on the left. And then we'll navigate down to the security section right here. And in the security section, you'll see we get conditional access that's available. We also get a few other options. So for example, if I click identity protection, you'll see it takes me into a separate screen where I actually have a multi-factor registration policy. So I can actually go in and say, well, I would like to use identity protection in Microsoft 365 and enforce, Azure AD multi-factor registration, which we don't have to, and you may not be licensed for that. So I'm going to go back to security. But if we do have conditional access licenses, then of course we can create them here. So I can say new policy. Let's call it MFA. I can then go to the users and groups, and I could say, instead of saying all users, because you notice it's complains here, I'm going to say users and groups. And then what I can do is I'm going to say all employees and just select all employees. So your best practice here is to have a group that's also excluded. So I can say exclude directory roles, and I'm going to scroll down. This one you should never do, but I'm going to go in and say exclude global admins from this rule. Well, actually you can do this because you should have a global admin rule anyway. So I go through and set this. I can then say all of the cloud apps. I can then go to conditions, and you'll see, are there any conditions that I wish to meet, which I'm not going to, and I'm going to say grant access and just choose require multi-factor authentication. Once I select that, you can see what we've got. It says multi-factor, all the users, excluding the group that I put in, every single cloud app, grant access. I could choose it to be on and click create. And at that point, the next time somebody authenticates, they will actually have to come in and, put in the credential and then pass the second factor for authentication. So fairly straightforward, a simple way of doing it. Now, if we go back to security, I'm going to click OK here and come back and click authentication methods while we're in here and click on password protection. You see that we now get access to things like the smart lockout capabilities that we talked about. So from here, you can see I've got my lockout. I've got my lockout in seconds. So what we can do is reduce that to a number 5. And maybe we don't want to have a lockout of 60 seconds. Maybe it needs to be 30 seconds, or maybe it needs to be longer. But while we're also here, we could do banned password list also. So let's take the top password of this year, password 1234. Maybe we go a little bit more complicated and say pass at word 123. And then of course this option I can set to yes, and then I can say enforced. And what this means is that when I press save, that if I have the agent installed on-prem, then the password protections that I've got here that I wish to utilize will then flow down to that as well. So really straightforward to actually enable the standard kind of account lockout, smart lockout capabilities, and also the banned passwords. Now, of course, our last thing to look at here would be how do we configure the interactive user sign out. Now, that's a strange one. So I'm going to go to the admin center and click SharePoint, which you may think is a little bit strange, but remember that the inactive user sign out is really focused on SharePoint and OneDrive. So I'm going to go into policies here and click access control, and then you'll see we get this idle session timeout. I'm going to click here, choose OK. I can say after 30 minutes and then give the user 15 minutes notice that they're going to get signed out. I can then click save. At this point, the interactive user sign out feature is then enabled. So if we put those all together, we obviously have multi-factor authentication for protection at the door. We have account lockout, password expiration, banned passwords for knocking at the door. And then, of course, we get the idle session timeout. So kind of 5 really simple yet powerful things that we can implement that will help us. Okay, so let's talk about our next block, which is our data flow. And we'll review the risks and protections. So the main one here is consent to unmanaged applications. Now, what's the risk and what does that really mean? Well, by default, most users are able to consent an application to themselves. So what that means is, let's say I'm in Microsoft Teams and I want to add an app, and the app is a third-party application. Maybe it's like a DocuSign app or something else. I can go in and say, I would like to add the app, and I consent. And you get that trust box. It's often what you get on a phone. You got an Android phone or something where it comes up and says, do you trust this specific app to do something? It's the same principle. You're basically allowing the application various permissions on your behalf. Now, of course, what that means is that if I'm an end user and I consent to a malicious app or something like that, then attackers can maintain a session or maintain a connection and retrieve information about me. Now, that may not be an issue if you're just an end user, but if I'm an admin or I have higher privileges than a regular end user, that could be used for all kinds of different things. Now, of course, the protection in Azure Active Directory is kind of twofold. So we can either modify the end user consent process to limit that, or we can do what's called the administration consent workflow. Both options will suffice. The first option is a series of choices that we can pick and say, well, I want to allow this or this or this. Whereas the administrator consent is basically the admin has to consent to everything. So what are the user consent options then? Well, first off, we can disable user consent, which means end users cannot grant permissions to any applications for themselves. The next one would be users can consent to apps, but we can at least limit it to either published, a verified one. So maybe you just want to trust the Microsoft applications and say, you can add Planner or you can add Whiteboard or something else. Or we can leave it as the default, which is users can consent to all applications, which I would highly recommend against, just purely based on how it kind of works. Now, of course, how can we set this? Well, the first option is to use PowerShell. So first off, we can say disable user consent. Now, the way this works is we don't actually have a value that we say, oh, disabled check. What we do is we use set Azure ADMS authorization policy, and we basically empty the property. So you can see I've got a at parentheses, which basically is an empty array. So the opposite to that is if I wish to allow consent for all applications, in this instance, Microsoft Legacy, then I can change that and populate that. So we can first set that using PowerShell, or we can actually configure user consent using Azure Active Directory. So we can sign into the portal, choose Enterprise Applications, click Consent, and then you can see the 3 options available to us. So we've got Do Not Allow, or Allow for verified or published, or allow consent, which clearly is the default value, and that's the option that needs to be changed. Our next block in here is the client forwarding rules. And as I mentioned before, this one's quite a common one. Now, what's the risk here? Well, in previous Office 365 data breaches, when I've had a chance to look at them, one of the first things that malicious actors do once they compromised accounts is actually create forwarding rules within email. And this means that they can exfiltrate data out of the organization to external recipients. So how can we protect from this? Well, first off, we can block the creation of client forwarding rules, which then will ensure that the content doesn't leave the organization. It also mitigates against that very common 365 attack, which seems to happen almost all the time. So from a forwarding perspective, what are the options available to us for setting? Well, we can first go into Exchange Online and disable allow remote forwarding or automatic forwarding for remote domains. We can disable that. We could also use role-based access control to limit the creation of that and the delivery of that. Or we can do what I class as the old school way, which is our transport rules, where we implement a transport rule that can stop emails but being auto-forwarded. It basically uses old school if logic. So it will say, if the sender is located in the organization and the recipient is outside and the message type is auto-forward, then we just reject them. So we have 3 different approaches that we can utilize. So that's one kind of attack vector that we can get rid of. Our last one here would be external sharing. Now, we could spend hours talking about the risk of this one, but to sum it up, your data leaves the organization, it could go anywhere. So what does that mean? Well, it could be legitimate data, or it could be PII data, it could be HIPAA data, it could be something that shouldn't leave the organization at all. And often, in most tenants, most organizations do not change the external sharing capabilities, because that's the reason why you went to Microsoft 365 in the first place. It also, remember, supports corporate accounts, which is okay, so business to business, people who have 365 already, and personal accounts. So for all you know, people could be streaming their data to Gmail accounts, Hotmail, and many other email providers. So what are the protections that we have? Well, we can restrict sharing to specific users or groups. We can control where the content can be either externally or internally shared from. We can configure the different types of sharing, and we can restrict it at different levels in the hierarchy as well. Now, for us to understand external sharing, we need to be reminded that settings and configuration are available in multiple locations, starting at the tenant, going to the admin centers, the site collections, and even the SharePoint sites. Sharing uses the hierarchy approach, but it can be broken at different levels and can be wide open when it really should be closed down. So let's go back into the tenant and we'll look at how we configure some of the protections. Okay, so our next 3 things that we're going to look at is obviously app consent, we're going to look at forwarding rules and external sharing. So let's start with app consent. So let's go back to Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to go right here. And what we can see is if we go down to app registrations, for example, I'm just going to click here, you'll be able to see the app registration. So for example, I have one called AIP Delegated User. If I click all applications, you can see there's a whole host. I'm just going to close these boxes here. You can see that LinkedIn's there, Box, Twitter, etc. So that's great. If I click on enterprise applications, you can then see there's a whole host of applications that are available and obviously visible to me as a user or as an admin. So Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, Yammer, OneNotes. Now, when we go to the bottom left section under security, you can see we have consent and permissions. And this is broken into 2 specific groups. So what we're talking about here is user consent. So first off, you'll notice the default is allow user consent for apps. That's on by default. So I'm going to change that to do not allow user consent, which means that they will not be able to add specific things in. They can't grant access to an app. Then, of course, we've got group owner consent. So if we're in a security group, Office 365, Microsoft 365 group, I can then say, allow the group owner to consent for users, or say do not allow group owner consent. So at that point, when I save that, that will update the app consent to ensure that users are unable to consent an application, and then an end user would have, an administrator even, would have to take care of that. I'm going to click OK here. Now, of course, what we've got here is we also have permissions, kind of the standard permissions that can be added for the low risk. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because I can add permissions here, and it's important to understand how the permissions work within Azure Active Directory. So we have access to all of these types of services. So for example, SharePoint, and if I scroll down, you can see if I click Sites, I get access to Search All. Or if I do the user, I get access to Read Write All. So these are the things that we're talking about in the app consent. So if I go back to Enterprise Applications, I can also then control things by utilizing the same conditional access policies that we just utilized for enabling multi-factor authentication. So I can go through and define conditional access policies to control who can even get to the apps in the first place. So we can control app consent. We can also restrict someone getting to the app in the first place. So that's how we kind of control app consent. Now I'm going to go back to the admin center here, and I'm going to go and click Exchange, because of course one of the big attacks that takes place once someone gains access is the creation of forwarding rules. Now what we can do is, of course, we can use remote domains option here, and you'll see I've got a remote domains configuration, and you'll see I've got some kind of base configuration, and you'll see it says allow automatic forwarding. So I can go edit reply types, and I can say uncheck allow automatic forwarding. And that would then restrict emails from being automatically forwarded to any of those domains, whatever those domains would be. I just have the default connection. If I had a remote domain, if I just go in and say .com, for example, just some random text, choose next, I can uncheck that too. So if we have remote domains that we trust, we can also configure and stop the remote transfer of the mail as well. Now, of course, we can use transport rules if we needed to. We don't have to use, mail flow. We can come in and, of course, you'll see we have some issues with Firefox here, but that's great. You need to use a different browser, but it will eventually load. So you can see I can say new, create a rule, and then in the rules, we can kind of go through what we would like to do and start to restrict the allowing forwarding, or use if statements to say, as an example, let's do create. So let's just put some text here. So if the recipient, let me wait for that to load. So we could do if the recipient, so let's do the is located, sorry. The recipient is located outside the organization. Then I can say more options here, add a condition, and say if the sender is external or internal, is internal, add a condition, and then of course we can go through and start looking at the properties of the mail. I'm not a great fan of this kind of interface, but you can see it slides things out. So if I do message type and say auto forward and click apply, now what we end up with is a rule that says, well, if the recipient is outside, the sender is inside, and it's auto forward, then what do you want to do? And I'm going to say block and reject the message without notifying anybody. And so that could be the rule that I wish to create, and that would block not only the remote domain option, but this is kind of more of a manual, like boom, I'm going to stop it from actually happening. So I'm going to click cancel here. Now, of course, our last thing here is external sharing. So I'm going to go back to SharePoint again. And it kind of makes sense to have external sharing here. External sharing, if we go back to the admin center, and if I go into things like settings and go to org settings, you can see we have security and privacy options. And if I scroll here, you can see sharing, and we have some kind of high level sharing options. But the bulk of the sharing is done in the policies, in the sharing inside here. And I'm sure you've seen this screen before where we have the ability to kind of control. The first thing that we should do is it should be at minimum new and existing guests, and even better would be existing guests. Anyone is not the greatest because it means literally anybody. If we're going to do anyone, then we need to change some of these settings. So if we kept it as anyone and existing, and the reason we have this is because OneDrive for Business is normally replacement for file shares, whereas SharePoint tends to be structured collaboration, and Teams is kind of back to that too. So what we can do is we could say, well, let's say I wanted SharePoint for anyone and maybe OneDrive for new and existing. What I could do is then limit by domains. So I could say you can only share with, Shareplicity, for example, or Microsoft or Oracle or whatever the domain is. We can also restrict who can actually share. So not everybody in the organization might need the ability to share. So I could come in and say manage security group. And then, maybe I could do S&G engineering, for example. Maybe they are the only group that can do external sharing. So we could do that option. Also, this is an option that you would want to check. So guests must sign in using the same account. So if you share Liam at Yahoo, for example, then that's what I have to log in with. I can't forward the email to Liam at Gmail and try to get in. So it's a way of tracking that they're coming in. You would never want to allow guests to share items that they don't own. And then, of course, we do have some verification pieces. So things that we can restrict. But the most important thing here is that whatever the permissions are here, they flow down underneath. So let me just save this. Okay, so remember what we have. We have most permissive and new and existing. So if I go into my sites here and choose active sites, you'll see I get a list of sites. And I'm going to go into the benefits one. So it's not a group. I just wanted a regular site. So I'm going to go into benefits. This will launch my benefits site. And it's a regular SharePoint site. So what I can do, I can click share. And you'll see I've got visitors and site owners and all that kind of fun stuff. So I could go in and let's say I wanted to add, Dave at gmail.com. Let me pick Dave. It comes back and it says, oh, hold on a minute. Your organization policy doesn't allow you to share with the users. Wait, hold on a minute. I'm pretty sure that I've got it set to anyone. So if we go back to my admin center here, I'm looking at this and going back to my sharing capability and it says most permissive. So in theory, I should be able to work. So let's go back to active sites and we'll go back to my benefits site here and click sharing. See the change here. So that specific location has been set to only people. So let me change that to anyone. Click save. Wait for that to update. Now I'm going to refresh. I'm going to click share. I'm going to click Dave at gmail.com. And sure enough, it now says we can send a message. So just be aware that the way that the security works, it's all based around the structure of the parent versus what you define at the lowest area. So if my sharing was set to existing guests only, so let me just save that. And then I went back to active sites and decided to use my Contoso brand option, for example, sharing, that the only option I can get to is the ones that are set at the parent. So the higher the parent, the more options there are at the lower levels. The lower the parent, the more restrictive on the choices that you have. So external sharing is really a critical one, and it's really important to kind of understand and get that right so that you can then set the permissions accordingly. So this one often takes time. Now, of course, SharePoint's not the only place that has kind of sharing. Obviously, when we go to the sharing, this covers OneDrive as well. But of course, back in the tenant, we have sharing. Of course, if I go to services in here, I can then scroll down a little bit and you can see I've got various applications. I can click SharePoint. And of course, notice I have existing guests only configured here. But if I go back to my admin center and just refresh, make sure that's right, it will say existing guests, existing guests. Now, if I change it here and do save and then refresh here, notice what happens. There's a one-to-one correlation between configuring here and what gets configured here. Be aware of how that works. That sometimes you have an admin that comes in and will make a change, and then the SharePoint admin makes another change, and the admin comes in and says, well, who changed that? And then changes that one back, and then you end up with this battle of who's going to win. So agree what needs to be used and then stick to that configuration. So external sharing can be controlled all the way down to the sites and the locations as well. Now, of course, if we happen to be using other capabilities, so for example, if we go into Teams and we want to go to the Teams admin center, then in here we have some flexibility of configuration, but it's not really targeted to the content. If I go to org-wide settings, we get external access, which is really communication to Skype and Skype for Business. But the guest access is the one where we allow external people outside of the organization to come in. The service default, as you can see, is on. So as soon as you use Teams, that's what's going to be available. So it's important to get those right. So those were our top 3 items in the data flow: app consent, forwarding rules, and then external sharing. Okay, so let's go into our last category here, which is devices. And once again, we'll review the risks and the available protections. So what's the risk here when we talk about legacy authentication? And what even is legacy authentication? I hear this a lot. It's now, there's like rules that everyone says, block legacy authentication, don't let it happen. But what is it anyway? So legacy authentication are the protocols that basically don't support multi-factor. So they are things like POP, SMTP, IMAP, MAPI, etc. Anything that can't do that. They are the basic authentication protocols. Now, in fact, more than 99% of all the password spray attacks that have been identified in Azure AD came from those legacy authentication protocols. So someone trying to password spray against IMAP or MAPI, for example. So what protections do we have? Well, there's no default protections that are switched on, or at least right now, unless you have a newer tenant that has the security defaults enabled, then there's no blocking using the legacy authentication. Now, what we can do, though, is we can block the legacy authentication. There is the ability to do that. We can force modern authentication approach across all of the workloads. And when we enable it, it basically will block any of the older entry points from being utilized, for example, in the password spray attacks. So legacy authentication needs to be identified first. You never just go in and, there we go, turn it off. It requires conditional access policies to be able to go through and do it properly. So there is one thing to be aware of. Or you can switch on the security defaults, which are off probably in your tenant. But there's a gotcha there that when you turn it on, there may be other things that will suddenly make it more complicated for the end user. So definitely one of our options to look at. Our final thing to look at is mobile application management policies. So this is you provision the new tenant. You've got all these people who want to come and access the tenant. They're using it in the office on corporate devices. And then they suddenly get their phone and they realize that they can log in on the Office 365 app or on a browser and access their email. So what's the risk? Well, the risk really isn't just Microsoft 365 related. It's anything where you can access it from a personal device. It means that technically an end user could sync OneDrive, SharePoint Online, other workloads to devices off the network and then have copies of that. Which of course, it means it's not encrypted, it's not protected, it's not controlled, it's just free reign. And that risk we need to mitigate. So what can we do? Well, we can utilize mobile device management policy, but then you would need to own the device. So mobile application management policies are ring-fenced to the apps themselves. So these are independent of whatever the MDM is. And actually, if you're using an MDM solution, maybe you're not using Microsoft Intune, but something else, that's okay. MAM policies work with it. So the core benefits for doing this is that you'll protect the organizational data. It will get containerized in the phone. It doesn't affect the end user. They don't really see anything. It just happens to do it. The policies don't apply when the app use is personal. So if I have an app that uses, let's say mail, for example, so Outlook, and I'm using it for my Hotmail account versus my corporate account, that when I flick contexts and go to the personal, the policies don't apply. And then when I come back, it does. And then, of course, app protection policies make sure that the protections are stuck and in place. Now, of course, it does mean that a device needs to be kind of connected to the network in order for that to work. And there's a policy that gets put down on the device, but it doesn't really interfere with the end users. So let's go back into the tenant and we'll look at configuring those last two protections. Our last two to look at, which makes up our 10, is part of the devices, is legacy authentication and MAM, mobile application management. So we're going to go to Active Directory first. And what we want to do is we want to be able to find out exactly what's been going on and who's been signing in, if anybody's been signing in using legacy. So to do this, we're going to go to Azure Active Directory and click under monitoring into the sign in option that's here. What we can then do is click add filters, and you'll see that we get this kind of add filtering option where we can kind of scroll up and down, and you'll see we've got a client app option. I'm going to click apply in the client app, and then I get a drop down. And the nice thing is here, they're broken into modern and legacy. So if I go into legacy here and select all the legacy options, you can see there's a whole host of these protocols that we can use. Okay, I can click apply, and what it will do is it will go ahead and query. Now the good news is in my tenant, it's just using managed and it's using the modern authentication. But in your tenant, it may not. You may actually have specifics in here where you have applications that are authenticating using that. So this is where we come. Azure Active Directory, sign-ins for monitoring, add a filter, choose client app, and then select the legacy authentication. If you have many of these listed, you can't just stop legacy authentication. You will need to actually come back in and fix what it is that's using legacy and then move forward that way. Now, of course, how do we actually restrict things like that? Well, if we go into our user settings here, what we can actually see is we get some basic protections. There's nothing in the user setting. We get nothing. If we go to properties, you'll see we get this link, which is what we're looking for. We get managed security defaults. Now, what we can do, I'm going to click the learn more link for you so you know what it's going to show you. And in the security defaults, you will see it does this. It requires all the users to register for Azure AD MFA. It requires admins to perform MFA. It blocks legacy protocols. It requires users to perform multi-factor when needed, and then it protects privileged activities as well. So you can enable that by simply doing this and pressing save, but I'm going to encourage you not to do that yet because that's adding a bit more complexity to it than just security defaults. So, but to block those, we can actually go a little bit further. So if I go back to security, let's say I want to block legacy authentication. I'm going to go to conditional access again. Remember, this is licensing. So I'm going to say block legacy. I'm going to say all users. I want to click the cloud apps and say all cloud apps. I'm going to say conditions and click client apps. And then I'm going to say configure and uncheck the modern and just choose legacy and click done. Then I'm going to go here and say block access. So what we end up having is it's going to complain about excluding, which is fine, but it's going to say that we need to block legacy for all the users, for all the apps with one condition set, which is that we're using client apps in legacy mode. And then of course we can block at that point. I'm going to say exclude, and I could create that one, and that would enforce the blocking of legacy authentication. So really straightforward. It does require conditional access licensing. So if you don't have that, you'll need to go and purchase Azure AD Premium licensing to be able to do that as well. Now, of course, once we've got that done, our last thing is mobile application management. So I'm actually going to go back to the admin center here and click on Endpoint Manager. This will require specific licensing just because it's using Endpoint Manager or Microsoft Intune. From here, we're going to go into the Apps section. And then from here, we can choose App Protection Policies. Now, there's a couple of defaults there, but I'm actually going to say Create Policy. And the first thing I have to do is choose the OS. So I'm going to say iOS iPad. And then let's call it Test 1. Choose Next. I can then go in and say I wish to target all the apps on the devices, or I could say no and choose managed apps or unmanaged apps, device types. An unmanaged device type is a BYOD device. I'm then going to select the apps that I'd like to protect. So I'm going to say, let me spell Microsoft correctly. Microsoft, admin, bookings, blah, 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 all the way down. I'm going to select a few of them like this and click select. So I've selected my list of Microsoft applications or any other applications I wish to protect. Choose Next. And then I get to go through and define, do I want to block backups? I'm going to allow no data to be transferred between apps. I'm going to allow cut, copy and paste, but only between the applications that I trust. I also want to block third-party keyboards. I want to make sure it's encrypted. I don't want to sync the data to anything that's not a managed app. I don't want to allow printing. Maybe I want to restrict the web transfer to the secure Microsoft Edge browser because I'm going to have people do that. And I don't need notifications. So choose Next. I'm then going to define a PIN for access or biometrics to launch the application itself. Choose Next. Then I can go through and do any condition. So if it's jailbroke, I want you to block it. Maybe, if it's a minimum version of the app, or maybe, a maximum OS version or whatever it would be, I define those, and that will be the conditions for joining in and using the applications. I'll choose Next. And then, of course, I can add the assignments. Now, it's important to know that these do need to go through an assignment process. So you'll need to select the groups you wish to assign this to. Choose Next. And then, of course, if we review it, you'll see it's targeting unmanaged devices for these specific applications. It's blocking the majority of everything, except I can cut, copy and paste between those apps. And then it blocks everything else. I'm requiring a PIN or biometrics or facial recognition for the app, as well as any conditional launching, and then assignments to these specific groups. And at that point, I can create the MAM policy. We can have multiple MAM policies. We can have single MAM policies. What they will do is encrypt the content, put it into a container, and then help you protect your corporate information. Once you have the devices in, then of course, if we go to devices and click all devices, you'll eventually see a device listed here, and you'll be able to wipe that corporate data from the secure container. So those were the last two: legacy authentication, which is the old protocols that don't support second factor authentication, and then of course MAM policies for protection of personal BYOD devices. So what are the takeaways from this session then, apart from going through the 6 pillars and the top 10 type of things? Well, first for me is for you to remember that with any security configuration, they're only ever as good as the attacks that are known. And so there may be instances where the security controls that even exist in things like Microsoft 365 just are not as effective. New attacks are surfacing almost daily, which could make them ineffective. And you may have to change the way that you think about things. Now, Microsoft luckily does provide multiple login capabilities and reports which need to be monitored. So it becomes essential, and I should really change the word to critical really, to continually monitor and review the reports and logs. And you're not only looking at them to make sure things are working, but also to look at how we can implement further controls and capabilities, as well as tweaking what's there in the first place. My final takeaway for you is go and take a look at the basic security setup for Microsoft 365. It's a document I wrote for Microsoft Community Documents. It's available using that link. And then go ahead and implement some of these technologies and these protections to ensure that you are as protected as you should be. So thank you again for listening to me. A big appreciation to the sponsors here. Please feel free to reach out to me, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me and to learn about the top 10 security capabilities within Microsoft 365.